Clara Maddox lived in a rented duplex on the east side of Ridgemont, a town small enough that everyone knew your business, but large enough that no one felt obligated to help. The duplex leaned slightly to the left, as though even the building had grown tired of standing upright. The paint on the front door had faded from red to a color that could only be described as surrender. Inside, the walls were thin enough that she could hear her neighbor's television through them, a constant murmur of someone else's life playing just beyond her own. She had 2 children. Lily was 9 and already too aware of the things her mother tried to hide. She noticed when the cereal box was lighter than it should have been, and when dinner was rice again for the 3rd night in a row. She noticed when her mother sat at the kitchen table after the lights were out, not sleeping, not reading, just sitting with her hands pressed flat against the surface, as if holding the table together might hold everything else together too. Marcus was 6 and still believed things would get better because his mother told him so. He carried that belief the way other children carried stuffed animals, clutching it close and refusing to let go even when it grew worn and thin. Clara had been alone since Marcus was 2. Her husband, a man who had once promised her the kind of life where she would never have to worry, had left on a Tuesday afternoon while the children were at school. He took the good truck, the savings account, and whatever remained of her belief that love was a reliable foundation. The divorce papers arrived by mail 3 weeks later, followed by a child support agreement that was honored for exactly 4 months before the payments stopped and the forwarding address became a dead end. She did not chase him. Chasing required energy and lawyers and the kind of righteous anger that she could not afford to feel. Instead, she adjusted. She moved from the small house they had rented together into the duplex. She sold what she could and donated what she could not sell. She rebuilt her life the way you rebuild a fence in winter, one post at a time, with frozen hands and no guarantee that it would hold. Clara worked 2 jobs. In the mornings, she cleaned rooms at the Ridgemont Motor Lodge, a place that smelled permanently of bleach and carpet shampoo and quiet desperation. And the rooms turned over in cycles she could predict by now. Truckers on Mondays, families passing through on weekends, and the occasional guest who stayed too long and left too little behind. She stripped beds and scrubbed bathrooms with a speed born from necessity rather than pride, her hands raw and cracked by midday. In the afternoons, she drove across town to a warehouse distribution center where she packed boxes for an online retailer until her back screamed and her fingers went numb from the repetitive motion of folding, taping, stacking, folding again. The pay from both jobs combined was not enough. It was never enough. Every month was a negotiation between which bill could wait and which one could not. The electricity stayed on because the children needed light for homework. The water stayed on because the children needed baths. And the rent was paid last and often late, a fact that her landlord reminded her of with handwritten notes slipped under the door, each one slightly more hostile than the last. She had tried asking for help once. She called her older brother, Dale, who lived 2 hours south, in a house with a pool and a truck that was always clean. He listened to her for about 90 seconds before cutting her off. "Clara," he had said, his voice carrying the particular brand of patience that meant he had already stopped caring. "You have got to stop expecting other people to fix your problems. You made your choices." That was the last time she called him. She did not make the same mistake twice. Her mother had left Ridgemont years before Clara was old enough to understand why. She moved in with a woman named Edith Greer, who lived alone on a patch of land so far from town it did not appear on most maps. The 2 women were not related by blood, but they shared the kind of bond that forms between people who have both been discarded by the same world. Clara's mother had lived there quietly, helping Edith tend a small garden and keep the property from falling apart. When Clara's mother died, Edith continued alone, growing older and more reclusive with each passing year. Clara had visited Edith only a handful of times as an adult. The drive was long, the road unpaved for the last several miles, and the property itself was not the kind of place that invited return visits. It sat at the edge of a shallow valley where the land was dry and cracked, and the only notable feature was a riverbed that had stopped carrying water before Clara was born. The bed cut through the property like a scar, its banks lined with smooth stones bleached white by decades of sun. Edith spoke about the riverbed the way some people spoke about old friends. She said it had a voice if you listened. She said it remembered what it used to be. Clara had nodded politely and changed the subject, assuming the isolation had taken its toll. The last time Clara visited, nearly 2 years before Edith's death, the old woman had pressed something into her hand as she was leaving. It was a stone, smooth and pale, with a faint streak of copper color running through its center. "Keep that," Edith had said, her grip surprisingly strong on Clara's wrist. It came from the deep part. Clara had thanked her, tucked the stone into her purse, and forgotten about it almost immediately. The demands of daily survival had a way of burying small moments beneath layers of urgency and fatigue. The stone eventually ended up in a junk drawer in the kitchen, buried beneath rubber bands, expired coupons, and a broken flashlight. Clara would not remember it until much later, when its significance had already been overtaken by what she found on her own. When Edith died in late autumn, the call came from a county clerk who spoke in a flat, official tone that suggested he delivered this kind of news several times a week. Edith had left no family, no savings, and no assets of value. What she had left was the land, all of it deeded to Clara Maddox. Yet the only name and the only document the county had found in the house. There was no explanation, no letter, no message beyond the deed itself. Just Clara's name, written in Edith's careful hand, and a description of the property that included 37 acres of unimproved land and a dry creek bed running north to south through the western quarter. Clara drove out the following Saturday, the children buckled into the back seat with books they were not reading and expressions that shifted between boredom and curiosity. The road narrowed as they left the highway, and the landscape opened into the kind of emptiness that made you feel both free and exposed at the same time. By the time she turned onto the unpaved track that led to Edith's property, Lily had pressed her face against the window and was staring at the barren ground with something close to alarm. "Where are the trees?" she asked. Clara did not answer because there was nothing to say. The trees had been gone long before she was born. The house was smaller than she remembered. It sat low against the land like something trying not to be noticed, its walls made of weathered wood that had turned the color of old bone. The porch sagged at one end, and the front steps had been replaced with cinder blocks stacked in uneven pairs. A single window on the east side was cracked, but still held together by what appeared to be tape and stubbornness. Inside, the rooms were sparse and clean, the kind of clean that came from having almost nothing to make dirty. A narrow bed, a wooden chair, a table with a single cup still sitting on it, and as if Edith had simply stood up and forgotten to come back. Clara walked through the house slowly, touching walls, opening drawers that held nothing, standing in the doorway of the back room where a window looked out over the dry riverbed. The bed stretched across the land in a wide, curving path, its surface covered in pale stones and cracked earth. It looked like something that had been emptied out and never refilled, a wound in the land that had scabbed over but never healed. She stood there for a long time, feeling the silence press against her like a hand on her chest. That evening, she mentioned the inheritance to her neighbor, a woman named Brenda who worked at the same warehouse and who had a talent for turning every conversation into a measurement of someone else's failure. Brenda leaned against the shared wall of their duplex and listened with an expression that shifted slowly from curiosity to amusement. "A dry riverbed," Brenda repeated, her voice climbing slightly at the end, as if the words themselves were the punchline. "That is what she left you. 37 acres of dirt and a riverbed with no river. Clara nodded, already regretting the conversation. Brenda shook her head and laughed. Honey, that is not an inheritance. That is a guilt trip with a property line. The words stung more than Clara wanted to admit, but she swallowed them the way she swallowed most things and went inside to make dinner. The next person to hear about it was her brother Dale. She did not call him. He called her, which was unusual enough that she answered on the first ring. His tone was casual, but there was a sharpness beneath it that she recognized from every conversation they had ever had about money or property or anything that could be counted. "So I heard you got some land," he said. Clara's stomach tightened. She asked him how he knew. He told her that the county clerk's office was public record and that he had a friend who worked there. He did not explain why his friend had been looking, and Clara did not ask. "What is it worth?" Dale said. Clara told him the truth. She did not know. She described the property as best she could: the dry land, the small house, the riverbed. Dale was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant he was calculating. Then he exhaled and said what she had been expecting. "Sell it. Take whatever you can get and move on. You do not need another burden. Clara, you are drowning as it is." She told him she would think about it. That was always the safest answer with Dale. He accepted it the way he accepted most things, she said, with a patience that was really just another form of dismissal. Over the following days, the news spread through the small circles of her life with the speed and precision of gossip that involved something people could feel superior about. At the motor lodge, her supervisor mentioned it during a shift change, raising her eyebrows and asking whether Clara was planning to become a rancher. When Clara said she was not sure what she was going to do with the land, the woman laughed and said that was probably for the best, since the only thing that grew out there was disappointment. At the warehouse, a co-worker named Steve, who had never spoken to her about anything other than shipping labels and break schedules, suddenly took an interest. He leaned against the packing station with his arms crossed and said he had heard about her big inheritance. He said the words, "big inheritance," the way you might say, winning lottery ticket to someone holding a losing scratch card. He asked her if the riverbed came with a canoe. The laughter that followed was not unkind, but was thorough. It traveled from station to station, growing louder as it went, until Clara felt it pressing against her from every direction, like heat from an open oven. At the gas station the following morning, a man she barely knew, someone who worked part-time at the county assessor's office, told her that Edith Greer had been crazy as a barn owl and that anything she left behind was probably cursed. He said it while filling his truck, not even bothering to face her fully, as if the information was so obvious it did not require his full attention. His wife, sitting in the passenger seat with the window down, added that she had driven past that property once and turned around because the land looked like the surface of the moon. They both laughed. Clara paid for her gas and drove away. Even at the school during pickup, another mother approached her with a sympathetic smile that did not quite conceal the satisfaction beneath it. "I heard about your inheritance," the woman said, touching Clara's arm as if she were ill. "That must be so disappointing. Is there anything we can do?" Clara thanked her and said she was fine. The woman nodded the way people nod when they do not believe you but have decided to let you pretend. Clara absorbed it all with the same expression she wore when the landlord slipped another note under her door. Neutral. Practiced. The face of someone who had learned that reacting to cruelty only invited more of it. But at night, after the children were asleep and the duplex was quiet, except for the murmur of the neighbor's television, she sat at the kitchen table and unfolded the deed. She ran her fingers over the description of the property, reading the words again and again. 37 acres, dry creek bed, north to south through the western quarter. She did not know why she kept returning to it. She only knew that the land felt like the only thing in her life that was not borrowed, rented, or about to be taken away. She returned to the property 2 weeks later, this time alone. The children stayed with Brenda, who agreed to watch them for a few hours in exchange for Clara covering her next weekend shift at the warehouse. The drive felt longer without the children's voices filling the silence. The highway gave way to county roads that grew narrower with each turn, the asphalt crumbling at the edges like bread left out too long. By the time she pulled onto the dirt track, the sky had turned the color of pewter, and the wind was pushing hard across the open land. Dust kicked up behind her tires and hung in the air, suspended and golden, as if the earth itself were exhaling. She parked near the house but did not go inside. She stood for a moment in the yard, if it could be called a yard, and looked at the land around her. It stretched in every direction, flat and sun-bleached and seemingly empty. The kind of landscape that made ambitious people turn away and practical people lower their expectations. A hawk circled far overhead, patient and unhurried, riding the thermals without visible effort. Clara watched it for a moment and felt a strange kinship with the bird, both of them scanning ground that no one else wanted. She did not go into the house this time. Instead, she walked straight to the edge of the dry riverbed and stood there, looking down at the pale stones and cracked earth. The bed was wider than she had remembered, maybe 20 feet across at its widest point, with banks that rose gently on either side. The stones were smooth and round, polished by water that had not flowed here in decades. She picked one up and turned it in her hand. It was warm from the sun, heavier than it looked, and its surface was streaked with thin lines of color that caught the light in unexpected ways. She stepped down into the bed and began to walk. The ground was uneven, the stones shifting under her feet, and she had to pick her way carefully to avoid twisting an ankle. The bed curved gently to the north, following a path that had been carved long before anyone living could remember. She walked for maybe 10 minutes before she noticed something that made her stop. The stones beneath her feet had changed. They were no longer pale and uniform. Some of them were darker, flecked with tiny crystals that glittered when the light hit them. She picked up several and held them close to her face, turning them slowly. The crystalline flecks were embedded in the rock itself, not sitting on the surface, but woven into the stone as if they had grown there. She put them in her pocket without thinking about it, the way a child collects things that are interesting without yet knowing why. She walked farther, following the curve of the bed as it narrowed slightly and the banks grew taller on either side. The wind was quieter down here, blocked by the earthen walls, and the silence had a different quality, deeper and more deliberate. She could hear her own breathing and the soft crunch of stones beneath her boots and nothing else. After another 20 minutes, she reached a point where the riverbed split. One branch continued north, the stones growing smaller and more scattered. The other turned sharply to the northwest, cutting between two low ridges that rose like shoulders on either side. And this branch was narrower and the banks were steeper, almost vertical in places. The stones here were different again, darker still, with veins of color running through them that she did not recognize. She hesitated at the fork, looking both ways, feeling the pull of something she could not name. Then she turned northwest, following the narrower path, and kept walking. The air changed as she moved deeper between the ridges. It was cooler, damper, carrying a faint mineral smell that reminded her of the old pipes beneath the duplex. The stones under her feet were wet in places, not from rain, but from something seeping up through the ground itself. She knelt and pressed her hand against the damp earth. It was cold, and when she lifted her palm, it glistened with a thin film of moisture that caught the fading light. She stood and looked ahead. The narrow bed continued between the ridges for another 100 yards before curving out of sight. She did not have time to follow it farther today. The light was already thinning, and the drive back was long. But something had shifted inside her, something quiet and stubborn that felt like the first real emotion she had allowed herself in months. It was not hope exactly. Hope was too generous a word for what she felt. It was closer to attention, the focused awareness that comes when you realize that the thing everyone told you was worthless might be something else entirely. She drove home with the stones in her pocket, their weight pressing against her thigh like a reminder. That night, after the children were in bed, she sat at the table and laid the stones out under the kitchen light. They were beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with value. The colors were subtle, grays and blues and faint golds that shifted as she turned them. The crystalline flecks caught the light and threw it back in tiny sparks that danced across the table. She did not know what she was looking at. She did not pretend to understand geology or minerals or the science of what made one stone different from another. But she knew that these stones were not ordinary. She had grown up in this part of the country, had walked fields and creek beds her entire life, and she had never seen anything like them. The next morning, she called the county library and asked if they had any books on local geology. The woman on the phone was helpful, but puzzled, as if the question itself was unusual. She told Clara there were a few reference books in the science section and a collection of old survey maps in the archives. Clara wrote down the information and thanked her, already planning her next day off. It took her a week to get to the library. Between shifts at the lodge and the warehouse and the constant machinery of keeping two children fed, clothed, and believing that their lives were not as fragile as they actually were, time was a luxury she could not afford to spend carelessly. But when she finally walked through the doors of the Ridgemont County Library, she carried the stones in a small cloth bag and a determination that surprised even her. The reference section was small and dusty, tucked into a corner that smelled of old paper and forgotten ambition, and she found 3 books on regional geology and carried them to a table near the window where the light was strong enough to read by. She opened the first one and began to search, page by page, comparing the descriptions and photographs to the stones in front of her. Most of what she read meant nothing to her. The language was technical, full of terms she had to look up in the glossary at the back. Igneous, metamorphic, hydrothermal. Each word was a door that opened into a room full of more doors. But she kept going, her finger tracing lines of text, her eyes moving between the page and the stones. She had not felt this kind of focus since school, and even then, she had never studied with this much urgency. School had been abstract. This was about her land, her future, her children's dinner. A librarian passed by twice, glancing at the stones on the table with mild concern, as if Clara might be damaging the furniture. The second time, Clara caught her eye and smiled. The librarian moved on without comment, and Clara returned to the books. It was in the second book that she found something that made her breath catch. A photograph, slightly blurred by age and printing, showed a cross-section of rock that looked remarkably similar to what she held in her hand. The caption beneath it described a type of mineral-rich formation found in certain arid regions where ancient waterways had once carried dissolved minerals downstream. Over millennia, as the water evaporated or changed course, the minerals had been deposited in layers, creating veins of concentrated material embedded in the surrounding stone. The book mentioned several examples from the American West. Places where dry riverbeds had been found to contain significant deposits of valuable minerals, including gold, silver, copper, and in some cases, rare earth elements that had become increasingly important in modern technology. Clara read the passage 3 times. Then she closed the book and stared at the stones on the table. Her hands were trembling, but her mind was very still. She was not a geologist. She did not know if what she had found was valuable or ordinary, or somewhere in between. But she knew that the stones from the riverbed matched the description in the book, and she knew that no one in Ridgemont had ever bothered to look. She checked out the books and carried them to her car, placing them on the passenger seat with the care of someone handling something fragile. On the drive home, she did not turn on the radio. She drove in silence, thinking about the riverbed, about the way it curved to the northwest between the ridges, about the moisture seeping up through the ground in a place everyone said was bone dry. She thought about Edith, alone on that land for decades, walking the riverbed every day. She thought about what Edith might have known and what she might have been protecting by saying nothing. That evening, Brenda knocked on her door and asked if she wanted to split the cost of a pizza for the kids. Clara agreed, and they sat together on the porch while the children ate inside. Brenda asked about the land again, her tone carrying the same casual cruelty as before. "Still planning to farm that dust bowl?" she said, smiling around a bite of crust. Clara looked at her for a moment, then looked away. "I am still figuring it out," she said. Brenda shrugged. "Not much to figure out, hun. Dirt is dirt." Clara nodded and said nothing more. She had learned that silence was sometimes the loudest thing a person could say. The following weekend, she returned to the property with supplies. She packed a backpack with water bottles, granola bars, the library books, a small notebook, a pencil, and a cheap magnifying glass she had bought at the dollar store. The children came with her again, and this time she told them they were going on an adventure. Marcus believed her immediately. Lily looked skeptical but did not argue, which was its own form of trust. They arrived at the property in the late morning. The sky was clear, and the sun was already high, turning the dry land into a shimmering canvas of browns and golds. Clara led the children down into the riverbed and pointed to the stones. She told them to collect the prettiest ones they could find, making a game of it. Marcus ran ahead with the enthusiasm of a child who had been given permission to get dirty. Lily followed more slowly, examining each stone before deciding whether it was worthy of her pocket. Clara walked behind them, watching the ground. She noted where the stones changed color, where the crystalline flecks appeared, where the moisture began to show. She wrote everything down in her notebook, marking distances by counting her steps. When they reached the fork in the riverbed, she paused and looked down the northwest branch. It was steeper than she remembered, the banks almost chest-high on either side. She told the children to wait and walked ahead alone. In the narrow passage between the ridges was cooler, almost cold, and the mineral smell was stronger here. The ground beneath her feet was soft in places, the earth dark with moisture that had no business being there in a land this dry. She walked for 15 minutes, farther than she had gone before, and the bed continued to narrow. The walls rose higher, the stones grew darker, and the veins of color in the rock became more pronounced. She could see them even without the magnifying glass now, running through the stone like threads in fabric, bright against the darker matrix. Then she saw it. Ahead, where the narrow bed curved sharply to the left, the ground was not dry. It was wet. Not damp, not slightly moist, but genuinely wet, with a thin film of water sitting on the surface of the stones. She knelt and touched it, and the water was cold and clear and had a faint metallic taste when she brought her fingers to her lips. Her heart was beating faster now, a rhythm she could feel in her temples, but she forced herself to move slowly, to observe rather than rush. She followed the wet ground around the curve and stopped. The bed opened into a small, natural alcove, maybe 30 feet across, sheltered on 3 sides by the ridges. The walls of the ridges here were layered with bands of color, rust and copper and deep green, striations that ran horizontally through the exposed rock like pages in a book written by the earth itself. And in the center of the alcove, rising from a crack in the exposed bedrock, was water. Not a torrent, not a gush, but a steady, persistent seep that pooled in a shallow basin no bigger than a bathtub before overflowing gently and spreading across the stones. The water was clear enough to see the bottom of the basin, where the rock was stained with bands of color so vivid they looked painted. Deep rust, brilliant copper green, streaks of gold that shimmered beneath the surface. Around the edges of the basin, mineral deposits had built up over what must have been centuries, forming delicate crusts of blue-green and white crystal that looked like frost on a winter morning. Clara stood at the edge of the basin and stared. The silence around her was complete. No wind reached this sheltered place, no sound from the road or the house or the world beyond the ridges. There was only the quiet, ceaseless movement of water rising from stone, carrying with it the colors of the earth itself. She felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them away. She was not going to cry in a riverbed over some colored rocks. But the feeling that rose in her chest was not about the rocks. It was about being alone in a place that no one else had cared enough to find. It was about standing in a hidden corner of land that the whole world had written off and discovering that it was alive, that it held something beautiful, that Edith had known, that Edith had always known. She knelt beside the basin and looked at the stained rock beneath the surface. The colors were not random. They followed the veins in the stone, concentrated where the mineral deposits were thickest. She could see the crystalline flecks here too, but they were larger, more defined, catching the light that filtered down between the ridges and throwing it back in tiny prisms. She did not know exactly what she was looking at, but she knew it was not nothing. She knew it was not dirt. She knew it was not a punchline. She took out her notebook and began to write, her hand moving quickly, recording everything she could see. The size of the basin, the rate of the water flow, the colors in the rock, the temperature of the water, the way the mineral veins ran through the exposed bedrock. She sketched a rough map of the alcove and marked the direction of the ridges. She collected samples of the stained rock, prying small pieces loose with her fingers and wrapping them carefully in the cloth bag. When she finally stood, her knees ached and the light had shifted. She had been kneeling for over an hour. She looked around the alcove one more time, taking in the stillness, the water, the hidden wealth of color and mineral that the land had been holding in secret for longer than anyone could remember. Then she turned and walked back down the narrow bed toward her children. Marcus was sitting in the middle of the riverbed with his pockets bulging with stones. Lily was beside him, arranging her collection in a neat line on a flat rock, sorting them by color. She looked up as Clara approached and studied her mother's face with the careful attention of a child who has learned to read adults the way other people read weather. "You found something?" Lily said. It was not a question. Clara sat down beside them and pulled the cloth bag from her pack. She opened it and laid the samples on the flat rock beside Lily's collection. The colors were immediately different. Lily's stones were pretty. The samples from the alcove were extraordinary. Even Marcus stopped what he was doing and stared. "What are those?" he whispered. Clara looked at her children, at their wide eyes and dusty hands and the sun on their faces, and felt something rise in her chest that she had not felt in so long she almost did not recognize it. It was not hope. It was certainty. Not certainty about what the minerals were worth or what the future held, but certainty that she had found something real, something that belonged to her, something that no one else had thought to look for because they had all been too busy laughing. "I do not know yet," she told Marcus, "but I am going to find out." The drive home felt different. The road was the same, the sky was the same. The rented duplex was waiting at the end of it the same way it always waited, leaning slightly to the left, the landlord's latest note probably already curling under the door. But Clara felt a shift inside herself, small but undeniable, like a key turning in a lock she had forgotten existed. She had spent years surviving, every day a negotiation between what she needed and what she could afford, every decision measured against the cost of failure. Survival left no room for discovery. It barely left room for thought. But today, she had walked past the place where everyone else stopped and found something that changed the shape of her silence. She did not tell anyone, not Brenda, not Dale, not her supervisor at the lodge or the co-workers at the warehouse who had already filed the inheritance under the category of amusing misfortune. She kept the samples in the cloth bag at the bottom of her closet, beneath a box of winter clothes the children had outgrown, and she kept the notebook in her purse where she could reach it during her breaks. Every spare moment she had, she read. The library books became her companions on the bus, in the break room, at the kitchen table after the children were asleep. She taught herself the language of geology the way she had taught herself everything else in her life, slowly, stubbornly, and without anyone's help. The words that had meant nothing a week earlier began to take shape. She learned about alluvial deposits and how rivers carried minerals downstream and dropped them when the current slowed. She learned about placer formations, where heavy particles settled in bends and eddies and accumulated over centuries. She learned about hydrothermal veins, where superheated water from deep underground pushed minerals through cracks in the rock and left them behind as the water cooled. Each concept added a layer of understanding to what she had seen in the alcove, and each layer made the discovery feel more significant. But knowledge without confirmation was just speculation, and speculation without proof was just another story people would laugh at. She needed someone who could look at the samples and tell her what they were, someone who would not dismiss her before she finished speaking. She found the name on a university website late one night, scrolling through faculty pages with tired eyes and a cup of coffee growing cold beside her. Dr. Nora Petrovich, Associate Professor of Geological Sciences, and her research focused on mineral deposits in arid regions of the interior West, and her faculty photograph showed a woman with short gray hair and glasses perched on the end of her nose, looking directly at the camera with an expression that suggested she did not suffer fools, but was willing to listen to anyone who had done their homework. Clara wrote the email 3 times before sending it. Each version was shorter than the last. She described the property in plain terms. 37 acres, dry riverbed, no active water source visible from the surface. She described what she had found. Moisture seeping through ground in an area classified as arid. A spring emerging from bedrock in a sheltered alcove. Minerals staining on exposed rock surfaces, showing colors consistent with copper and iron deposits and possibly other metallic minerals. To crystalline inclusions in river stones collected from the bed. She attached photographs she had taken with her phone, apologizing for the quality, and asked if Dr. Petrovich would be willing to examine the samples. She hit send and then sat staring at the screen for 10 minutes, her heart beating as if she had just run up a flight of stairs. The response came 2 days later, short and professional. Dr. Petrovich thanked her for the inquiry and said the photographs were interesting but inconclusive. She asked if Clara could send the physical samples for preliminary analysis. She provided a mailing address and a note explaining that an initial assessment would take approximately 2 weeks. Clara wrapped the samples in tissue paper, placed them in a small cardboard box padded with newspaper, then mailed them the next morning before her shift at the lodge. The postage cost more than she had expected, and she felt the familiar pinch of spending money on something that might lead nowhere. But she thought of the alcove, of the water rising through stone, of the colors beneath the surface, and she sealed the box and handed it to the clerk without hesitation. The 2 weeks that followed were the longest of her life. She worked her shifts, fed her children, paid what bills she could, and waited. Every evening she checked her email with a mixture of dread and anticipation that made her fingers clumsy on the keyboard. Days passed with nothing. She told herself that no news was not bad news, that university professors were busy, that 2 weeks might stretch to 3. She told herself all the sensible things that sensible people say when they are trying not to hope too hard. During those 2 weeks, life continued to remind her of its indifference to her private excitement. The truck needed an oil change she could not afford. Lily came home from school with a permission slip for a field trip that cost $20, and Clara had to sign it knowing she would need to rearrange the grocery budget to cover it. The landlord's latest note was more pointed than the previous ones, mentioning legal options in language that was clearly copied from somewhere online. She read it, folded it, and placed it in the drawer with all the others, a small archive of threats that had become as routine as breakfast. At the warehouse, Steve asked her again about the inheritance, this time in front of a larger group. He said he had been thinking about it and had decided that she should open a spa out there. A dry riverbed spa, he said, for people who like their massages extra dusty. The laughter that followed was the kind that feeds on itself, growing louder than the joke deserves because the audience wants to participate in someone else's smallness. Clara smiled thinly and returned to her station. She packed 14 more boxes before her shift ended, each one sealed with tape and labeled with a precision that bordered on defiance. On the 11th day, the email arrived. She was sitting in the break room at the warehouse, eating a sandwich she had made that morning from the last of the bread and a jar of peanut butter that was nearly empty. Her phone buzzed and she looked down and saw the name Petrovich in her inbox. She put the sandwich down and opened the message with hands that were not entirely steady. "Dear Ms. Maddox," the email began, "I have completed a preliminary analysis of the samples you sent. The results are noteworthy and warrant further investigation. The stones from the riverbed contain significant concentrations of native copper, with traces of silver and gold, consistent with a hydrothermal vein system. The crystalline inclusions appear to be a form of chalcopyrite, a copper-iron sulfide mineral that is often associated with economically significant ore deposits. Additionally, the stained bedrock samples show concentrations of rare earth elements, specifically cerium and neodymium, at levels that are unusual for surface deposits and suggest a substantial subsurface source. I would very much like to visit the site and conduct a more thorough assessment. If you are amenable, I can arrange a visit within the next few weeks." Clara read the email 3 times. Then she locked herself in the bathroom and cried. She cried quietly, the way she had learned to cry, with her hand pressed over her mouth and her shoulders shaking silently, because even in the privacy of a warehouse bathroom, she could not shake the habit of keeping her pain to herself. But these were not tears of pain. They were tears of something she had not allowed herself to feel in so long that it arrived like a stranger, unfamiliar and overwhelming. It was the feeling of being right. Not vindicated, not triumphant, not smug. Just right. She had looked at something everyone else dismissed, and she had seen it clearly. And now a woman with letters after her name was telling her that what she saw was real. She washed her face, dried her hands, and went back to packing boxes. She did not tell anyone at the warehouse. She did not tell Brenda when she got home. She did not call Dale. She sat at the kitchen table that night with the email open on her phone and the deed spread beside it, and she let the 2 documents talk to each other in the quiet of the room. 37 acres, copper, silver, gold, rare earth elements, a substantial subsurface source. She thought of Edith, alone on that land for all those years, walking the riverbed, collecting stones, saying nothing to anyone. She thought of the way Edith had spoken about the riverbed's voice, about how it remembered what it used to be. She had not been eccentric. She had been paying attention. And when the time came to leave something behind, she had chosen the one person she believed would do the same. Clara remembered the stone Edith had pressed into her hand during that last visit, the one she had dropped into the junk drawer and forgotten. She stood, crossed the kitchen, and opened the drawer. It took her a moment to find it beneath the clutter, but when her fingers closed around it, she recognized the weight immediately. She held it under the light and saw what she had not seen before. The copper streak was not just color. It was mineral, the same crystalline structure she had found in the alcove, the same material that Dr. Petrovich had identified as chalcopyrite. Edith had been telling her for years, not in words that Clara was ready to hear, but in the only language the old woman trusted, the language of the land itself. That Clara folded the deed carefully and placed it back in its envelope. Then she opened her notebook and began to write, planning the details of Dr. Petrovich's visit with the same quiet determination she brought to everything else in her life. The children were asleep. The duplex was silent except for the murmur of the neighbor's television. Outside, the night was dark and ordinary. But inside Clara Maddox's kitchen, something extraordinary had already begun. That is where we pause for now. But this story is far from over. The question is not whether Clara found something valuable beneath that dry riverbed. The question is what happens when the rest of the world finds out. Stay right here. The next part of this story will change everything you think you know about what it means to inherit something worthless. Doctor. Nora Petrovich arrived on a Thursday morning in a car that was older than Clara expected and covered in a fine layer of dust that suggested the woman had driven a long way without caring how she looked when she got there. She stepped out in hiking boots and a canvas jacket with pockets that bulged with instruments Clara could not name. Her hair was shorter than in the faculty photograph, and her glasses sat on top of her head rather than on her nose. She looked at the land around her with the kind of attention that Clara recognized immediately. It was the same look Clara had worn the first time she stepped into the riverbed. Not judgment, not dismissal, just looking. Really looking. Clara met her in the yard and shook her hand. Dr. Petrovich's grip was firm and brief, the handshake of someone who preferred doing to greeting. And she glanced at the house, at the cracked window, at the sagging porch, and then turned her gaze toward the open land. "Show me the riverbed," she said. "Not a request, a direction." They walked together across the dry ground, their boots raising small clouds of dust with each step. Clara led her down the bank and into the bed itself, following the same path she had traced twice before. Dr. Petrovich walked slowly, pausing every few steps to crouch and examine the stones. She pulled a small hammer from one of her pockets and tapped the surface of a rock, listening to the sound it made with her head tilted slightly, the way a musician listens to a note. She picked up stones, turned them, held them to the light, and set them down again without comment. Clara watched her and said nothing. And she had learned by now that silence was more useful than questions when someone was concentrating. They reached the fork in the riverbed, and Clara pointed to the northwest branch. Dr. Petrovich studied the narrow passage between the ridges for a long moment, her expression shifting from professional interest to something more focused. She ran her hand along the exposed wall of the bank, where the layered bands of color were visible even without the magnifying glass. She tapped the rock face with her hammer and listened. Then she tapped again in a different spot. Her eyes narrowed. "The mineral expression changes here," she said, more to herself than to Clara. "This is transition zone. The deposits are concentrated upstream." She began walking faster, her boots finding sure footing on the uneven ground despite their size. Clara followed, feeling the temperature drop as the walls of the passage rose around them. The air grew cooler and the mineral smell returned, sharper now than Clara remembered. Dr. Petrovich noticed it too. She stopped, inhaled deliberately, and nodded as though the air itself had confirmed something she had been suspecting. When they rounded the final curve and the alcove opened before them, Dr. Petrovich stopped walking. She stood at the edge of the space and stared at the basin, at the water seeping from the bedrock, at the vivid staining on the stone beneath the surface. For nearly a full minute, she did not move. Then she let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for longer than the walk. "My God," she said quietly. Clara stood beside her and felt the words settle over the alcove like a second kind of silence. and she had needed someone to say that. She had needed someone who understood what they were looking at to stand in this hidden place and acknowledge that it was extraordinary. Dr. Petrovich moved carefully to the edge of the basin and knelt. She pulled instruments from her pockets with the practiced speed of someone who had done this 1,000 times. A pH meter went into the water. A small glass vial collected a sample. She scraped mineral deposits from the rim of the basin and sealed them in plastic bags, labeling each one with a marker and a code that meant nothing to Clara, but clearly meant everything to her. She examined the exposed bedrock with a hand lens, tracing the veins with her finger, murmuring terms that Clara caught in fragments: chalcopyrite, azurite, malachite, native copper. The words floated in the still air like the names of things that had been waiting to be called. She spent 3 hours in the alcove. Clara sat on a flat stone near the entrance and watched, answering questions when they came. "How far does the property extend beyond the ridges?" Clara told her. 37 acres total, most of it to the east and south, but the ridges and everything between them were included. "Has anyone drilled here?" "Never." "Has anyone tested the water before?" Not that Clara knew of. "Has the county surveyed this section?" Clara shook her head. The property had been assessed for tax purposes decades ago, and the assessment had been based on surface conditions. No one had walked the riverbed. No one had followed it upstream. No one had looked. Dr. Petrovich finally stood and brushed the dust from her knees, and her expression had changed. The professional detachment was still there, but beneath it was something that looked almost like urgency. She walked back to Clara and sat on a nearby stone, pulling out a small notebook and flipping to a fresh page. She drew a rough map of the alcove, the basin, the ridges, and the direction of the mineral veins. Then she looked at Clara directly. "I need to be honest with you," she said. "What I am seeing here is preliminary. I cannot give you a definitive answer without proper core samples, detailed spectral analysis, and a full geological survey. That takes time and equipment I did not bring." Clara nodded. She had expected that. "But," Dr. Petrovich continued, her voice dropping slightly, "what I can tell you is that the surface indicators are among the strongest I have ever seen outside of a known mining district. The mineral veins in this bedrock are not random. They are part of a hydrothermal system, which means they extend downward, possibly deep. The concentrations of copper are significant on their own. But the rare earth signatures in the samples you sent me, that is what made me drive 4 hours to get here." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. Rare earth elements are not common in this kind of geological setting. When they appear at the concentrations your samples suggest, it usually means there is a substantial source below. We are not talking about scattered traces. We are talking about a deposit. Clara felt her mouth go dry. She asked the question she had been afraid to ask since the email arrived. What does that mean in terms of value?" Dr. Petrovich looked at her for a long moment. Then she shook her head slowly. "I cannot put a number on it today. Anyone who does is either guessing or lying. But I can tell you that if the subsurface deposit matches what the surface is showing, you are sitting on something that major mining companies would consider significant. We are potentially talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in mineral rights alone." The words hung in the air between them. Clara heard them, understood them, and felt absolutely nothing. It was as if the number was too large to fit inside her body, too vast to be processed by a mind that had spent years measuring life in units of $20 and half-tanks of gas. She stared at the water seeping from the stone and tried to connect the quiet, a hidden beauty of this place with a figure that could change not only her life, but the lives of everyone she had ever known. She could not do it. Not yet. The connection was there, but it was like looking at a bridge from a distance. She could see it, but she had not yet walked across it. Dr. Petrovich seemed to understand. She did not press. She simply closed her notebook and stood. "I would like to bring a team back," she said. "2 colleagues and some equipment. We would need a few days on site. Is that something you would allow? Clara said yes, without hesitation. Dr. Petrovich nodded once. Then she looked around the alcove one more time, her gaze lingering on the mineral crusts at the edge of the basin. She said something then that Clara would remember long after the numbers and the reports and the legal documents had blurred together. "Whoever owned this land before you," she said quietly, "they knew. They absolutely knew." The drive home was a blur. Clara's hands gripped the steering wheel with a steadiness that surprised her, because inside she was shaking, not with excitement, not with joy, with the terrifying weight of possibility. She had spent so long expecting nothing that the arrival of something felt like a threat. Her mind raced through scenarios the way it always raced through budgets, automatically, compulsively, searching for the place where things would go wrong. The deposit might not be as large as the surface suggested. The analysis might reveal contaminants that reduced the value. The legal process of establishing mineral rights might be complicated, expensive, beyond her reach. Dale might find out. The county might intervene, and someone might claim the land was never Edith's to give. Each possibility landed in her chest like a stone dropped into water, sending ripples of anxiety outward until her whole body hummed with it. She picked up the children from Brenda's apartment and drove them home. Marcus chattered about a cartoon he had watched. Lily was quiet, studying her mother's face in the rearview mirror, with that unsettling perceptiveness that made Clara feel both proud and exposed. "You look different," Lily said. Clara glanced at her in the mirror. "Different how?" Lily shrugged. "Like you are thinking about something big." Clara smiled, the kind of smile that was meant to reassure but probably did the opposite. "Just tired, baby?" Lily did not look convinced. She turned back to the window and watched the town slide past, its familiar shapes made strange by the fading light. That night, after the children were asleep, Clara sat at the kitchen table and wrote down everything Dr. Petrovich had told her. She wrote in her notebook in small, careful letters, as if the act of recording the information would make it more real. Hydrothermal vein system, copper, silver, gold. Rare earth elements, cerium and neodymium. Substantial subsurface source, hundreds of millions. She stared at the last two words until they stopped looking like language and became shapes on a page, abstract and meaningless. Then she closed the notebook and pressed her hands flat against the table, the same gesture she made every night when the weight of her life felt like too much to carry. But tonight the weight was different. And tonight it was not the weight of debt or exhaustion or the slow erosion of hope. It was the weight of something growing, something that required her to be stronger than she had ever been, not weaker. She did not sleep well. She dreamed of water rising through stone, of colors spreading beneath the surface of the earth, of Edith standing at the edge of the riverbed with her hand extended, offering a stone that glowed with a light that had no source. Word got out faster than she had imagined possible. She never learned exactly how it happened. Perhaps someone at the university mentioned the trip. Perhaps a neighbor noticed the unfamiliar car parked near the property. Perhaps the small-town network of observation and gossip simply did what it always did, turning private moments into public knowledge with the efficiency of a machine designed for exactly that purpose. Whatever the cause, by the following Monday, people were talking. The first sign was Brenda. She knocked on Clara's door on Monday evening with a bottle of cheap wine and an expression that combined friendliness with the sharp focus of someone who smelled an opportunity. She sat on Clara's couch and asked casual questions about the property, her voice light and conversational, but her eyes tracked Clara's reactions with a precision that made the air between them feel thinner. "I heard someone from the university came out to look at your land," Brenda said, swirling the wine in her glass. "That is exciting." Clara said it was just an academic visit, nothing to get worked up about. Brenda nodded slowly, the kind of nod that indicated she did not believe a word of it. She stayed for an hour, circling back to the land 3 more times before Clara pleaded tiredness and walked her to the door. After Brenda left, Clara stood in the kitchen and felt the first cold thread of fear weave through the hope she had been carefully tending. Dale called the next day. His voice was different this time. Gone was the dismissive patience, the older brother tone that treated her problems as self-inflicted inconveniences. In its place was something smoother, more considered. The voice he used when he was conducting business. He did not ask how she was. He did not ask about the children. He asked about the land. He said he had been thinking about it and that he wanted to help. He said he had connections in real estate and mineral rights and that navigating this kind of thing alone was a mistake. He said the words alone and mistake with particular emphasis, as if they were warnings rather than observations. Clara listened with her jaw tight and her free hand pressed against the kitchen counter. She asked him what kind of help he had in mind. Dale was ready for the question. He outlined a proposal with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed it. He would handle the business side. He would bring in the right people. He would make sure she did not get taken advantage of. In exchange, he wanted a partnership. 50-50. He said the number as if it were generous. Clara closed her eyes. She saw the riverbed, the alcove, the water rising from stone. She saw Edith's hand pressing a stone into her palm. She saw the deed with her name on it. Only her name, not Dale's, not anyone else's. The land had been left to her, and there was a reason for that. She told Dale she would think about it. He accepted the answer the way he always did, with the confidence of someone who believed that thinking about it was the first step toward agreeing. After the call, Clara sat at the table for a long time, staring at the phone. Then she opened her laptop and searched for mineral rights attorneys in the state. She found one whose website described her practice as focused on protecting independent landowners from predatory agreements. Her name was Janet Ruiz, and her office was 2 hours north in the state capital. Clara sent an email that night, brief and direct, describing her situation. She attached a copy of the deed and Dr. Petrovich's preliminary report. Janet Ruiz called her back the following afternoon. Her voice was warm but businesslike, the voice of someone who had heard many stories like Clara's and knew that warmth without action was worthless. She asked Clara 3 questions. Was the deed clear and uncontested? Yes. Had Clara signed anything with anyone regarding the property? No. Did Clara intend to maintain full ownership? Yes. Good, Janet said. Then here is what we need to do. The days that followed took on a rhythm that was unfamiliar to Clara, the rhythm of preparation rather than survival. Janet Ruiz filed a formal assertion of mineral rights on Clara's behalf, establishing her legal claim to whatever lay beneath the surface of the property. She ordered a title search going back to the original land grant, ensuring there were no competing claims, liens, or easements that could complicate ownership. She contacted Dr. Petrovich's university to establish a formal partnership for the geological survey, ensuring that the academic team's findings would be properly documented and legally admissible. Each step was a brick in a wall that Clara was building around herself and her children, a wall that would need to be strong enough to withstand whatever was coming. And something was coming. She could feel it the way farmers feel weather, not in the details, but in the pressure. The county assessor's office sent a letter requesting an updated property evaluation. The timing was not coincidental. Clara forwarded it to Janet, who responded with a letter of her own, politely but firmly establishing that no evaluation would take place until the geological survey was complete, and that any attempt to reassess the property before then would be challenged. The letter was copied to 3 officials and 2 legal organizations. The assessor's office did not respond. Dale called again. This time his voice was less smooth and more insistent. He told Clara that she was being naive. He told her that people were talking and that the kind of attention she was attracting would bring vultures. He said the word vultures with a particular bitterness that Clara recognized as projection. He offered again to handle things. This time the split was 60-40 in his favor. He justified it by saying he had more experience, more connections, more understanding of how the world worked. Clara told him no. Not maybe. Not I will think about it. No. The word came out of her mouth with a clarity that surprised them both. She did not raise her voice. She did not explain herself. She simply said no and let the word stand on its own, the way it should have stood years ago when he told her she was drowning, when he told her she made her own choices, when he offered 4 months of child support and then vanished into a life with a pool and a clean truck, and the comfortable certainty that his sister's poverty was her own fault. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough for her to hear her own heartbeat. Then Dale exhaled, and when he spoke again, the smoothness was gone entirely. "You are going to lose everything, Clara. You do not know what you are doing. You have never known what you are doing. That is why you are where you are." And the words were designed to wound, and they did, but not in the way he intended. They did not make her doubt herself. They reminded her of every conversation she had ever had with him, every dismissal, every condescending pause, every piece of advice that was really a verdict. And standing in her kitchen with the phone pressed to her ear, she realized that Dale had never seen her clearly. He had seen what he needed to see in order to feel better about himself, and he had mistaken that comfortable fiction for truth. She told him she might not know everything, but she knew whose name was on the deed. Then she hung up and stood in the kitchen with her hands trembling and her chest tight, feeling the aftershock of a confrontation that had been decades in the making. She had never said no to Dale like that before, or she had never said no to anyone like that before. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff and choosing not to step back. Dr. Petrovich returned 2 weeks later with a team. There were 3 of them in total. Dr. Petrovich led, followed by a younger geologist named Marcus Chen, who carried equipment cases with the careful devotion of someone transporting sacred objects, and a graduate student named Sarah, whose job seemed to involve taking photographs of everything and saying remarkable under her breath at intervals that grew shorter as the day progressed. They arrived in 2 vehicles loaded with instruments Clara could not identify, and set up a base near Edith's house with an efficiency that suggested they had done this many times before. The survey took 4 days. Clara could not be there for all of it. She had shifts at the lodge and the warehouse that she could not miss without losing the income that still, despite everything, kept her family fed and housed. But she came every morning before her shift started, and every evening after it ended, driving the long road in the gray light of early dawn and again in the amber light of dusk. Each time she arrived, the team had new information, new samples, new readings that deepened the picture of what lay beneath the riverbed. On the first day, they confirmed the hydrothermal vein system. The veins were not isolated. They formed a network that radiated outward from a central source deep beneath the alcove, extending in multiple directions under the property. The copper concentrations were consistent and high, well above the threshold that commercial mining operations considered economically viable. The silver and gold were present in smaller quantities but still significant, carried upward by the same geothermal processes that had created the vein system. On the second day, Marcus Chen ran spectral analysis on the bedrock samples and confirmed the presence of rare earth elements at concentrations that made him set down his instruments and walk outside for a moment. When he came back in, his face was carefully neutral, but his hands were not entirely steady. He showed Clara a chart on his laptop. She did not understand the numbers, but she understood his voice when he explained them. The cerium and neodymium deposits were not surface phenomena. They were part of the deep geology of the site, concentrated in a formation that extended downward farther than their equipment could measure. He said the concentrations were comparable to active rare earth mining operations in other parts of the world. Operations that produced materials worth billions of dollars annually. On the third day, they mapped the water source. The spring in the alcove was fed by an underground aquifer that carried dissolved minerals up through the rock. Dr. Petrovich explained the significance of this with the careful emphasis of someone who wanted to make sure Clara understood every implication. The aquifer was not only a source of mineral-laden water, it was a geological fingerprint, a map pointing downward toward the deposit's core. The water chemistry told them where the veins were thickest, where the concentrations were highest, and then how deep the system extended. She said it was like having a natural drill that had been running for thousands of years, bringing samples to the surface without anyone having to dig. But there was more. The spring also meant the property held water rights, a resource nearly as valuable as the minerals themselves in a region where water was scarce and getting scarcer. In parts of the West, water rights had been fought over with more ferocity than mineral claims. Owning a sustainable underground water source on 37 acres of otherwise arid land was not just an asset, it was leverage. It meant that any future development of the property would not depend on municipal water supplies or expensive pumping operations. The land contained its own sustenance. Dr. Petrovich explained that the aquifer appeared to be ancient and fed by deep geological processes rather than surface rainfall, which meant it was likely sustainable regardless of drought conditions. Clara listened and wrote everything in her notebook, her pencil moving across the page in the same small, careful letters she had used since the beginning. She wrote the word sustainable and underlined it twice. On the fourth and final day, the team gathered in Edith's kitchen, their equipment packed and their faces carrying the particular tiredness of people who have spent days doing work that matters. Dr. Petrovich spread a map across the table and walked Clara through the findings, section by section. She was thorough and precise, but even her professional composure could not entirely conceal the excitement beneath her words. The property contained a confirmed copper and precious metals deposit with estimated surface and near-surface reserves valued at approximately $120 million. Below that, the rare earth element formation, if its depth and concentration were consistent with the preliminary readings, could be worth significantly more. Dr. Petrovich paused here and looked at Clara directly. She said the words that would divide Clara's life into before and after. Based on comparable deposits and current market values for cerium and neodymium, the total estimated value of the mineral rights on this property is between $400 million and $600 million. Clara stared at her. The number did not feel real. It felt like a word in a foreign language, something she could hear but not translate. She looked at the map, and at the colored zones that marked mineral concentrations beneath land, she had walked in borrowed hiking boots and a jacket from the thrift store. She looked at the deed that still sat in her purse, the same piece of paper the county clerk had handed her in a flat, bored voice. 37 acres, dry creek bed, north to south through the western quarter. Dr. Petrovich gave her a moment. Then she said something that pulled Clara back into the room. "This is why you need protection," she said. "Once this information becomes public, and it will become public, you will face pressure from every direction. Mining companies, speculators, government agencies, family members." She said the last two words gently, but Clara heard the warning in them. "People will tell you that you cannot handle this alone. Some of them will be right about the complexity, but wrong about the solution. Do not let anyone take this from you by convincing you that you are not smart enough to keep it." Clara nodded. She did not trust her voice. She sat there in Edith's kitchen, surrounded by instruments and maps, and the careful work of people who had spent 4 days confirming what a lonely old woman and a broken single mother had both understood in their own ways. The land was not worthless. It had never been worthless. It had only been unseen. The team left that evening. Dr. Petrovich shook Clara's hand at the door and told her the formal report would be completed within 3 weeks. She said she would recommend the site for further study and that her university would likely seek a research partnership. She said the word partnership without any of the predatory undertones that Dale had given it. It meant something different when it came from someone who wanted to study the land rather than strip it. Clara drove home in the dark. The children were asleep at Brenda's, and she had the silence of the car to herself. She did not turn on the radio. She drove with the windows cracked, letting the cool night air fill the space around her, and she let herself feel what she had been holding back for days. It came in waves. Relief first, so powerful it made her grip the steering wheel to stay steady. Then fear, sharp and specific, the fear of someone who has suddenly been given something that others will want to take. Then grief. That was the one that surprised her. Grief for Edith, who had lived on that land and guarded its secret and died without ever seeing it acknowledged. Grief for her mother, and who had lived there too and who might have known or might have simply loved the old woman who did. Grief for herself, for all the years she had spent believing that she had nothing, that she was nothing, that the world had assigned her a place, and there was no use fighting it. She pulled over on the shoulder of the highway and sat there for 10 minutes, crying harder than she had cried since the day her husband left. These were not quiet tears. These were the kind that shook her whole body, that made sounds she did not recognize as her own, that left her gasping and wrung out and somehow lighter than she had felt in years. When she finally wiped her face and pulled back onto the road, the sky ahead was clear and the stars were out. And the highway stretched before her like a line drawn towards something she could not yet see but was no longer afraid to approach. The formal report arrived 3 weeks later, as promised. It was 64 pages long, bound in a blue cover with the university's seal on the front, and written in language that required Janet Ruiz to translate most of it into terms Clara could act on. But the numbers were clear. The estimated total value of the mineral deposits, including copper, silver, gold, and rare earth elements, was conservatively placed at $470 million. The upper estimate, pending deeper core sampling, was $620 million. Janet called her the morning the report arrived. She had received her own copy directly from Dr. Petrovich's office. Her voice was calm, but carried an undercurrent of urgency. "We need to move quickly," she said. "The report will become part of the public record once the university files it. After that, everything changes." She outlined the steps. First, a formal mineral rights claim filed with the state, reinforcing Clara's ownership. Second, an independent appraisal commissioned by Clara herself, ensuring that the valuation was not controlled by any outside party. Third, a trust established in the names of Clara and her children, protecting the asset from any legal challenges to Clara's personal finances. Fourth, and this was the part that made Clara's breath catch, a public disclosure strategy. Janet explained that keeping the discovery secret was no longer an option. The university report would be published. Media would follow. And mining companies would reach out. The question was not whether the world would find out, but whether Clara would control the narrative when it did. Clara agreed to everything. She signed documents at Janet's office during a day off she could not afford to take, sitting in a leather chair that felt too comfortable for someone who still had calluses on her hands from scrubbing motel bathrooms. Janet walked her through each page with patience and precision, explaining every clause, every protection, every potential challenge. When they finished, Clara asked a question that had been sitting in her chest since the first email from Dr. Petrovich. "Can they take it from me?" Janet looked at her for a long moment. Her expression was the kind that lawyers wear when they want to be honest without being discouraging. "They can try," she said. "People always try. But the deed is clean. The mineral rights are established. You have independent verification from a reputable university. And you have me." She paused and leaned forward slightly. "Clara, you own this. Legally, completely, and without question. The only way someone takes it is if you let them. Clara nodded. She did not let the relief show on her face because she had learned that visible relief was an invitation for the next blow. But she felt it, deep and warm, spreading through her chest like the first sip of coffee on a cold morning. She owned it. The dry riverbed that everyone had laughed about, the 37 acres of dust and regret, the punchline that Brenda had turned into a running joke at the warehouse. She owned it all. And what it held was worth more than every person who had ever mocked her would earn in their combined lifetimes. The news broke on a Tuesday. A regional newspaper picked up the university's publication and ran a story with a headline that Clara read 3 times before accepting that it was about her. Forgotten property holds mineral fortune. Single mother's inherited land valued at nearly $500 million. The article was thorough and surprisingly fair. It described the property, the discovery, the geological assessment, and the history of the land. It mentioned Edith by name and included a photograph of the riverbed that someone from the university team must have provided. It quoted Dr. Petrovich saying that the site was one of the most significant mineral discoveries in the region in over 50 years. Clara's phone began ringing before she finished reading the article. She recognized some of the numbers. Others were unfamiliar. She let them all go to voicemail and drove the children to school with the radio off and the windows up, insulating herself and them from a world that was suddenly very interested in their existence. Marcus asked why her phone kept buzzing. She told him people were calling about work. Lily looked at her in the rearview mirror and said nothing, but her silence was louder than any question. At the school drop-off, other parents stared. One woman, someone Clara had never spoken to beyond a polite good morning, approached the car and tapped on the window. Clara lowered it an inch. "Is it true?" the woman asked, her voice pitched between excitement and accusation. "Is it true about the land?" Clara smiled and said she was late for work. She pulled away from the curb and drove toward the lodge, watching in the mirror as the woman stood in the parking lot, still staring. At the lodge that morning, her supervisor found her in the supply closet and stood in the doorway with an expression that was equal parts disbelief and poorly concealed resentment. "I saw the news," she said. Clara continued stacking towels. This was the same woman who had asked her 3 weeks ago if she was planning to become a rancher. The same woman who had scheduled Clara for the worst shifts without explanation, and had once told her that the world does not owe you anything when Clara asked for a holiday adjustment. Now she stood in the doorway with her arms folded across her chest and her lips pressed thin, looking at Clara as if she were a stranger who had walked in off the street. The supervisor crossed her arms tighter. "So I guess you will be quitting." Clara set the last towel on the shelf and turned to face her. "Not today," she said. The supervisor stared at her for a moment, then shook her head and walked away, muttering something Clara chose not to hear. At the warehouse that afternoon, Steve was waiting by her station. His grin was wide, and his tone was the aggressive friendliness of someone who had realized too late that the person they had been mocking was no longer beneath them. He said he always knew she had something going on. He said she was smart to keep it quiet. He said he was happy for her, and his eyes said something entirely different. Clara thanked him politely and packed her boxes. She did not engage. She did not gloat. As she worked her shift the way she had worked every shift, with efficiency and silence, and when it was over, she drove home. Brenda was sitting on the porch of the duplex when Clara arrived. She was not holding wine this time. Her hands were empty, and her expression was stripped of its usual casual cruelty. She looked smaller somehow, as though the news had rearranged her proportions. Clara sat beside her and waited. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Brenda exhaled and said the only honest thing she had ever said to Clara in the years they had lived side by side. "I was wrong," she said. "I was wrong about the land, and I was wrong about the way I talked about it. I am sorry." Clara looked at her and saw something she had not expected to see. Not envy, not calculation. Shame. The real kind. The kind that costs something to feel. She told Brenda it was all right. She meant it. Not because the mockery had not hurt, but because carrying resentment required energy she intended to spend elsewhere. Dale did not call. He texted. 1 message, 3 words. "We need to talk." Clara read it, set the phone face down on the table, and went to make dinner. She sliced vegetables and boiled water and set plates for 3. The same routine she had followed 1,000 times, and she let the familiarity of it hold her in place while the world outside her kitchen rearranged itself around a truth she had uncovered with her own 2 hands. During dinner, Marcus told her about a science project at school where they had to grow crystals in a jar. He asked if crystals were the same thing as the sparkly rocks she brought home from the land. Clara paused with her fork halfway to her mouth and looked at her son, at his wide eyes and his earnest question, and the way his small hands gestured when he talked about things that excited him. She told him they were similar. She told him that the earth made crystals very slowly, over thousands of years, and that the sparkly rocks from the riverbed were the earth's way of showing what it had been making all that time. Marcus considered this with the gravity of a 6-year-old processing a new idea. Then he asked if the earth could make a crystal shaped like a dinosaur. Clara laughed. It was the first unguarded laugh she had released in weeks, and it felt like putting down something heavy she had forgotten she was carrying. Lily watched the exchange and smiled, not at the joke, but at her mother's face. She had been waiting for that laugh. She had been watching for it the way she watched for all the signs that told her whether the world was safe. After dinner, after homework, after baths and bedtime stories, and the slow, tender ritual of tucking 2 children into beds that were too small and blankets that were too thin, Clara sat alone at the kitchen table. The deed was in front of her. The notebook was beside it. The formal report, still in its blue cover, sat at the edge of the table like a guest who had arrived early. She opened the notebook to the first page, where she had written her earliest observations about the stones in the riverbed. The handwriting was tentative, uncertain, the writing of someone who did not yet know what she was looking at but refused to stop looking. She turned the pages slowly, watching her own understanding grow entry by entry, from confusion to curiosity to conviction. The last entry was the one she had written the night Dr. Petrovich's report arrived. It said, in the same small, careful letters she had used throughout, $470 million. Copper, silver, gold, rare earth elements. The land Edith left me, the land everyone laughed about, the land that was never empty. It was only quiet. She closed the notebook and looked toward the window. Outside, the night was dark and the street was still, and the duplex leaned slightly to the left the way it always had. But Clara Maddox was no longer the woman who lived in it out of necessity. She was the woman who would leave it by choice, on her own terms, in her own time, when she was ready. And she was almost ready. The offers began arriving the next day. Letters on heavy paper from companies whose names she did not recognize. Phone calls from men with smooth voices who spoke about opportunities and partnerships and synergies as if these words were gifts rather than nets. Emails that appeared in her inbox with the frequency of rain, each one proposing a different arrangement, a different split, a different version of the same fundamental proposition. Let us handle this for you. You do not have the experience. You do not have the resources. You need us. Janet Ruiz had warned her about this. She had described it as the storm after the discovery, the predictable rush of people who would appear with open hands and closed intentions. She told Clara to forward everything to her office and to sign nothing, agree to nothing, and promise nothing. Clara followed the instructions to the letter. Each envelope was opened, read, and forwarded. Each voicemail was listened to once and deleted. Each email was marked, archived, and sent to Janet. She did not respond to a single one. The mining companies were the most persistent. 3 of them sent representatives within the first week. One arrived unannounced at the duplex on a Saturday morning, a man in a pressed shirt and expensive shoes who looked profoundly uncomfortable standing on a porch with peeling paint. He introduced himself as a development consultant and offered Clara what he called a preliminary partnership agreement. He quoted a number that was meant to impress her. $12 million for a controlling interest in the mineral rights. Clara looked at him, looked at the number on the paper he held, and felt something she had not expected. Not anger, amusement. The man was offering her $12 million for something worth nearly $500 million, and he was doing it on her porch, in front of her house, where her children ate cereal for dinner 3 nights a week because she could not afford anything else. The disparity was so vast it crossed from offensive into absurd. She told him she was not interested. He blinked, recalibrated, and offered 15. She repeated herself and closed the door. She heard his expensive shoes click down the cinder block steps and the muffled sound of a car door closing. Then she went to the kitchen and laughed. She laughed hard enough to double over, hard enough to make Lily come out of her room and ask what was so funny. Clara could not explain it. She only knew that the laughter felt like freedom. And she had not felt free in a very long time. The second week brought attention from another direction. A reporter from a national outlet called and asked for an interview. Clara declined. 2 more called. She declined again. She was not ready to be a story. She was still living one. But the story was being told without her, in articles and opinion pieces and social media posts that she did not read but that others described to her with varying degrees of accuracy. She was called a lucky woman. She was called a savvy investor. She was called an inspiration and a fraud, and everything in between by people who had never met her and would never walk the riverbed she had walked alone. Through all of it, she continued to work her shifts. She cleaned rooms at the Ridgemont Motor Lodge and packed boxes at the warehouse and drove her children to school and made dinner from whatever was cheapest at the grocery store. She did this not because she had to, but because the structure kept her grounded while everything else was moving. The day was coming when she would leave these jobs and this duplex and this version of her life. But she would leave when the foundation beneath the new version was solid enough to stand on, not a moment before. She had spent too long living on ground that could shift beneath her feet. She was not going to build the next chapter of her life on anything less than bedrock. And the bedrock, as it turned out, was exactly what she had. But the hardest part of Clara's journey was not the discovery. And it was not the laughter or the offers or the pressure from people who suddenly wanted a piece of what she owned. The hardest part was still ahead. Because what the riverbed held beneath its surface was only the beginning of what it would reveal. And the next chapter of this story, the one where everything Clara Maddox had built and protected and believed in would be tested by forces she had not imagined, that chapter was about to begin. And it would start, as all the most important things in her life had started, with a knock at the door she did not expect. The knock came on a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks after the newspaper story ran. Clara was standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing dishes, while Marcus drew at the table and Lily read a book on the couch with her legs tucked beneath her. The knock was firm but not aggressive, and the kind that belonged to someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say. Clara dried her hands on a towel and opened the door. The man standing on her porch was not someone she recognized. He was tall, lean, somewhere in his 60s, with silver hair combed neatly to one side and a face that carried the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades controlling his expressions. His clothes were expensive but not flashy. Dark slacks, a pressed shirt open at the collar, shoes that had been polished recently enough to catch the porch light. Behind him, parked at the curb, was a black sedan with tinted windows and a license plate from out of state. He introduced himself as Gerald Ashworth. The name meant nothing to Clara. Then he said he represented a consortium of private investors with interests in mineral development across the western states. He said he had been following the story of her property with great interest. He said he was not here to make an offer, at least not the kind she had been receiving. He was here to talk about the future. Clara studied him for a moment. She had learned, in the weeks since the news broke, to read people differently than she once had. She no longer took words at face value. She listened for what was behind them, the way you listen for what is behind a wall when you knock on it. Gerald Ashworth's words were smooth and his manner was respectful, but there was something beneath both that she could not yet identify. She told him she was not interested in partnerships or investments. He nodded as if he had expected that. And then he said something that made the air between them change. "I knew Edith Greer," he said. Clara's hand tightened on the doorframe. She did not invite him in. She did not step back. She stood exactly where she was and waited. Gerald Ashworth told her a story. He spoke carefully, choosing his words the way someone handles old glass, with awareness of its fragility and its value. He said that 40 years ago, a geological survey had been conducted on the land that now belonged to Clara. The survey had been commissioned by a mining company that no longer existed, a company called Redstone Mineral Group, based out of Denver. They had identified the mineral deposits beneath the riverbed through aerial surveys and follow-up ground sampling, and they had begun the process of acquiring the property. Their method was not unusual for the time, and they approached the landowner with a preliminary offer, one that was designed to seem generous while representing a fraction of the land's actual worth. The assumption, as it always was that a person living alone on a remote piece of unimproved land would not have the knowledge or the resources to challenge the valuation. Edith Greer had been approached with an offer of $150,000. The amount was generous by the standards of the time, enough to set her up comfortably for the rest of her life in a modest town. She could have taken it, moved into a small house somewhere with plumbing that worked on the first try, and neighbors close enough to wave to. She could have lived out her years in comfort, free from the isolation and the labor of maintaining a property that most people considered worthless. Oh, she refused. Clara felt something shift inside her chest. She asked why. Gerald looked past her for a moment, toward the dim interior of the duplex, as if seeing something that was not there. Then he brought his gaze back to her. "Because Edith believed that the land should belong to someone who would protect it," he said, "not someone who would strip it bare and move on. She turned down the money and she hired a lawyer and she fought the acquisition for 3 years. She won, but it cost her almost everything she had. The company walked away, and the survey was buried. The records were sealed as part of the settlement. No one was supposed to know what was down there." Clara's throat was tight. She asked how Gerald knew all of this. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he had been a junior geologist on the original survey team. He had been 26 years old, fresh out of graduate school, and he had stood in the same alcove that Clara had found and had seen the same colors in the stone. He had written the report that confirmed the deposit, and he had watched as the company tried to take the land from a woman who had every right to keep it. He said he had left the company not long after. He said the experience had changed him. He said he had spent the decades since building a career that he hoped made up for the way that first job had ended. He said he had kept track of Edith from a distance, checking in through public records, never reaching out directly because he was not sure she would want to hear from anyone connected to the people who had tried to take her home. When he saw the newspaper article about Clara's discovery, he said he knew he had to come, not to make a deal, not to claim a share, but to tell Clara something that no one else alive could tell her. Edith had not simply inherited the land and grown old on it. Edith had fought for it. She had sacrificed comfort and security and the good opinion of everyone around her to keep it, and she had done it not for herself, but for whoever came after her. Someone she believed would understand what the land was worth in a way that had nothing to do with money. Clara stood on her porch in the evening light and felt the story settle over her like a second skin. She thought of Edith pressing the stone into her hand. She thought of the deed with her name on it, written in careful letters by a woman who had spent 40 years guarding a secret and had chosen, in the end, to pass it to the one person she trusted. Not Dale, not the county, not a corporation. Clara. The woman who cleaned motel rooms and packed boxes and fed her children rice for dinner and never once stopped believing that things could be different. She thanked Gerald Ashworth. She did not invite him in, and he did not ask to be invited. He reached into his jacket and produced a thin envelope, which he held out to her. Inside, he said, was a copy of the original survey report from 40 years ago. He had kept it all this time, in violation of the settlement agreement, because he believed that buried truth was worse than any legal consequence. He told her to give it to her lawyer. He told her it would make the mineral rights claim unassailable because it proved that the deposits had been known and documented decades before anyone tried to contest her ownership. Clara took the envelope. Why, it was light in her hand, but the weight of what it represented made her arm tremble. Gerald nodded once, a gesture that carried more emotion than anything he had said, and walked back to his car. She watched the black sedan pull away from the curb and disappear around the corner. Then she went inside, locked the door, and sat at the kitchen table with the envelope in front of her. Marcus had fallen asleep at the table, his crayon still in his hand. Lily was watching her from the couch, her book forgotten in her lap. "What was that about?" Lily asked. Clara looked at her daughter. She saw the intelligence in those eyes, the watchfulness, the fierce protective instinct that had developed in a 9-year-old who had been forced to grow up faster than she should have. Clara told her the truth, or as much of it as a child could hold. "A long time ago," she said, "someone tried to take our land from the woman who owned it. She fought to keep it. She won. And she gave it to us because she believed we would take care of it." Lily considered this for a moment. Then she asked the question that cut straight to the heart of everything. Why did she believe that? Clara felt the tears rising, but held them back. She smiled instead, and it was the most honest smile she had given anyone in years. "Because she knew us," she said. "Even before we knew her." Janet Ruiz received the original survey report the following day. Clara drove to the Capitol and placed it in Janet's hands personally, unwilling to trust it to the mail. Janet read it in her office with Clara sitting across from her, watching the lawyer's expression change as the pages turned. When she finished, Janet set the document down and pressed her fingertips together in a gesture that Clara had come to recognize as the way Janet processed information that altered the landscape of a case. "This changes everything," Janet said. Not because the deposit was unknown, Dr. Petrovich had already confirmed it independently, but because the original survey proved that a mining company had identified the deposits 40 years ago, had attempted to acquire the land, and had been legally defeated by the rightful owner. The settlement that followed had sealed the records, but it had not extinguished the mineral rights. Those rights had remained with Edith, and through Edith's deed, they now belonged to Clara. The original survey also documented the full extent of the deposit with a level of detail that even Dr. Petrovich's team had not yet reached, and including deep core samples taken at multiple points along the riverbed. The numbers in the original report were staggering. They confirmed that the deposit extended far deeper than the recent survey had been able to measure, and the estimated total value, adjusted for current mineral prices, exceeded the upper range of Dr. Petrovich's assessment. Janet looked at Clara across the desk. "The conservative estimate based on this data," she said, "is $650 million. The upper range approaches $800 million. Clara heard the numbers the way she heard thunder in the distance. She knew they were real. She knew they were significant. but they still felt like they belonged to someone else's life. Someone who drove a clean car and wore clothes without warehouse dust on the cuffs and did not know the exact price of a gallon of milk because it mattered. Janet filed the original survey with the State Mineral Rights Authority that afternoon, along with a supplemental brief that established the unbroken chain of ownership from the original land grant through Edith Greer to Clara Maddox. The filing was copied to every entity that had expressed interest in the property, every mining company, every speculator, every county official who had sent a letter or made a phone call. The message was clear and deliberate. The land was Clara's. The minerals were Clara's. The rights were established, documented, and protected by 40 years of legal precedent and a settlement agreement that had already been tested in court. The calls slowed after that. Not because interest had faded, but because the legal terrain had shifted so decisively that even the most aggressive players recognized the cost of challenging it. The development consultant who had offered $12 million did not return. The consortium Gerald Ashworth had mentioned never made contact. The county assessor's office filed a revised evaluation that reflected the new data and sent Clara a notice that her property taxes would increase significantly, which Janet challenged and negotiated down to a figure that was substantial but fair. For the first time since the discovery, Clara felt the pressure begin to lift, not disappear. Pressure like this never fully disappeared. But it eased enough for her to breathe, to think, and to begin imagining what came next without the constant fear that it would be taken away before it arrived. She gave notice at the warehouse first. She walked into the shift manager's office on a Monday morning and told him she would be leaving in 2 weeks. He nodded without looking up from his clipboard, then paused and met her eyes. He was a quiet man who had never mocked her or praised her, who had simply processed her existence the way the warehouse processed packages, efficiently and without sentiment. "Good luck," he said, and he meant it. She could tell by the way he said it, without irony or performance, just 2 words offered honestly by a man who understood what it meant to work a job that took more than it gave. She gave notice at the lodge the following week. Now her supervisor received the news with a tight smile and a comment about how nice it must be to not need a paycheck. Clara did not respond to the comment. She finished her final shift the way she had finished every shift, with clean rooms, fresh sheets, and towels stacked in precise rows. She left the key card on the front desk and walked out into the parking lot and did not look back. The duplex was harder, not because she loved it, but because it had been the container of her worst years and her bravest moments. The thin walls had heard her children laugh and cry. The kitchen table had held her tears and her plans and the deed that changed everything. The sagging porch had been the stage for Brenda's apology and Gerald Ashworth's revelation and 100 smaller scenes that no one would ever know about. She packed slowly over the course of a week, filling boxes with the careful attention of someone who understood that even difficult places deserved to be left with respect. Marcus asked where they were going. Clara told him they were going to the land. He asked if it had a television. She laughed and told him they would figure that out when they got there. Lily did not ask where they were going. She had already known. The move happened on a Saturday in early spring. The morning was cool and bright, the kind of day that felt like a fresh page in a book you had been reading for too long. Clara had hired a contractor through Janet's recommendation to make Edith's house livable before they arrived. The work had taken 6 weeks, and Clara had visited the site every weekend to check the progress. Walking through rooms that smelled of sawdust and paint and the particular promise that comes with spaces being made new. The roof was repaired, its old shingles replaced with material that would hold against decades of sun and wind. The porch was rebuilt with treated lumber that sat level and solid beneath her feet. The cracked window was replaced with double-pane glass that caught the light and held the warmth. The plumbing was updated, the wiring brought to code, and a new water heater installed that delivered hot water without the groaning and clanking that had been part of the old system's personality. The rooms were painted in colors Clara had chosen herself, soft greens and warm whites that made the small house feel like something that had been cared for rather than endured. And the kitchen was given new countertops and a stove that worked on the first try, a luxury that Clara had not experienced since before her marriage ended. A small addition had been framed on the south side, creating a bedroom for the children that caught the morning sun and had windows large enough for Lily to read by natural light. The house was still modest. It was still small. It sat low against the land the way it always had, as if trying not to draw attention to itself. But it was solid now, in a way it had not been before. And when Clara pulled up the dirt road with her children in the back seat and their belongings in a rented trailer behind them, she saw the house not as it had been, but as it was becoming. A place that had been given a second chance, the same way she had. Marcus was out of the car before she had fully stopped, running across the yard toward the open land with the boundless energy of a child who had spent his entire life inside the walls of a rented duplex. Lily climbed out more slowly, standing beside the car and looking around with an expression that was equal parts wonder and calculation. "It is quiet," she said. Clara stood beside her and listened. She was right. It was quiet. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of space, of land that stretched far enough in every direction to absorb sound and return stillness. Clara put her arm around her daughter's shoulders, and they stood there together, listening to the land breathe. The first thing Clara did after unpacking the essentials was walk to the riverbed. She went alone, leaving the children to explore the house and the yard under the watchful absence of anything that could harm them. And the bed was the same as she remembered, pale stones and cracked earth, the faint mineral smell rising in the afternoon heat. She walked the path she had walked before, past the fork, into the narrow passage between the ridges, and around the final curve to the alcove. The basin was there, the water still seeping from the bedrock, the colors still vivid beneath the surface. Nothing had changed. The land had been waiting, the way it had always been waiting, patient and certain and utterly indifferent to the opinions of people who had never bothered to look. She knelt beside the basin and placed her hand in the water. It was cold and clear, the same water that had been rising through stone for centuries, carrying the earth's hidden wealth to the surface one molecule at a time. She thought of Edith kneeling in this same spot, or her aged hands in the same cold water, her mind holding the same secret. She thought of the 40 years Edith had spent on this land, guarding it, protecting it, living simply so that no one would have a reason to look too closely. She thought of the original survey team, the young geologist who had stood here and seen what she was seeing now, and the company that had tried to take it. She thought of the settlement, the sealed records, the decades of silence, and she thought of the deed, the single piece of paper that had transferred not just property, but trust. "Edith," she said quietly, "I am here." The water continued to seep, the colors continued to shimmer, and Clara Maddox knelt in the hidden heart of her own land and let herself believe, fully and without reservation, that she deserved to be there. And the months that followed were a study in transformation conducted at a pace that would have frustrated anyone who expected wealth to change a life overnight. Clara did not rush. She had spent years learning that rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes, when you were poor, could not be absorbed. They accumulated. They compounded. They became the architecture of a life that never quite stabilized. Now that she had the resources to build something lasting, she intended to build it correctly. Janet Ruiz negotiated the first mineral rights lease on Clara's behalf. It was not a sale. Clara retained full ownership of the land and the deposits. What she granted was a limited extraction license to a mid-sized mining company that had been vetted by both Janet and Dr. So Petrovic, and whose track record included environmental protections that Clara insisted upon before any agreement was signed. The lease terms were structured to provide Clara with an immediate signing bonus and ongoing royalties based on extraction volumes. The signing bonus alone was $32 million. Clara sat in Janet's office and signed the documents with the same hand that had scrubbed motel bathrooms and sealed warehouse boxes. The pen felt ordinary in her fingers. The numbers on the page did not feel ordinary, but she had learned by now that numbers were only meaningful in relation to what they could do. $32 million was not a number to her. It was Lily's education. It was Marcus's future. It was a house that did not lean. It was food that was not rice. It was the absence of fear, and the absence of fear, as she had come to understand, was the most expensive thing in the world. She paid off every debt she had ever carried. The credit cards that had been maxed for years, their balances growing like weeds no matter how carefully she trimmed the payments. The medical bills from Marcus's ear infection 2 winters ago that she had been paying in installments of $20 a month, each payment accompanied by a letter reminding her of the remaining balance as if she could have forgotten it. The small loan she had taken to fix the car when the transmission failed in the middle of winter, and the only other option was walking 3 miles to the bus stop in the dark. The accumulated late fees from years of rent payments that arrived days after they were due because payday fell on the wrong week, and the math simply did not work no matter how many times she recalculated it. Each payment was a small liberation, a thread cut from a net that had held her down for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to move freely. She paid them one at a time, sitting at the kitchen table in Edith's house with her laptop open and the online banking portal glowing on the screen. She watched each balance drop to 0 and felt something release inside her. A tension she had been carrying for so long it had become part of her posture, part of her breathing, part of the way she moved through the world. When the last balance reached 0, and she sat in her kitchen on the property and stared at the screen of her laptop and felt a lightness in her body that was so unfamiliar it frightened her. She had to remind herself that it was not a trick, that the numbers would not reverse themselves overnight, that the ground beneath her was, for the first time, truly solid. She established a trust for the children, funded generously enough to ensure that neither of them would ever face the choices she had faced. The trust was structured with the same care that Janet Ruiz brought to everything, layered with protections and conditions that ensured the money would serve the children rather than spoil them. The funds would be available for education, for housing, for the foundational expenses that turned potential into reality. They would not be available for impulse or waste. Clara had seen what money did to people who received it without understanding its weight, and she was determined that her children would know the value of what they held. Lily would go to college. Marcus would go to college. They would have options. They would have the luxury of choosing their lives rather than accepting whatever life assigned them. Clara understood, in a way that only someone who had lived without choices could understand, that this was the real fortune. Not the minerals beneath the ground or the money in the account, but the freedom to decide. She did not move into a mansion. She did not buy a new car for 6 months, and when she finally did, it was a sturdy, reliable truck suited to the property rather than a vehicle designed to announce wealth. She wore the same clothes until they wore out and replaced them with clothes that were better made but not extravagant. She did not change her hair or her habits or the way she spoke to people in town. The only visible difference, and it was not small, was the steadiness in her eyes. The wariness that had lived there for years, the constant vigilance of someone who expected the next blow, had been replaced by something quieter and stronger. Confidence. Not the loud, performative kind that Dale had always wielded like a weapon, the kind that came from having been tested and having survived. The community around Ridgemont responded to Clara's transformation in ways that revealed more about the community than about her. Some people were genuinely happy. The librarian, who had helped her find the geology books, sent a handwritten note congratulating her and inviting her to speak at a community event about local history. The older man from the feed store, who had remembered the barn being built, sought Clara out at a gas station and told her he was glad the land had ended up in the right hands. The school principal called to ask if Clara would consider sponsoring a science program for the elementary school, and Clara said yes before the sentence was finished. Others were less graceful. The development consultant who had offered $12 million was seen in town telling anyone who would listen that he had been the first to recognize the property's potential and that Clara had made a mistake by not working with him. Steve from the warehouse told co-workers at a bar that he had always been nice to Clara and implied that she owed him something for it. The supervisor at the lodge mentioned to a reporter who came through town that Clara had been an average employee at best, as if this were relevant to anything other than the supervisor's need to diminish what she could not share. Clara heard about all of it and was bothered by none of it. She had lived inside the laughter and the dismissal and the casual cruelty of people who measured others by what they could see on the surface. She had survived it not by fighting it, but by refusing to let it define her. Now that the surface had changed, the people who had judged her by it were left holding opinions that no longer fit, and their discomfort was not her responsibility. Dale came to the property once. He drove up on a Saturday afternoon without calling ahead, his clean truck kicking up dust on the dirt road. Clara saw him from the kitchen window and felt her stomach tighten in the old familiar way. The reflex was instantaneous, a muscle memory from years of conversations that left her feeling smaller than she was. But by the time she walked outside to meet him, the tightness had loosened. She was standing on her own land in front of her own house, with her children playing in the yard behind her. Marcus was chasing a grasshopper with the focused determination of a boy who had discovered that the world contained things worth pursuing. Lily was sitting on the porch steps reading a book about minerals that Dr. Petrovich had sent her. Clara had nothing to defend and nothing to prove. Dale stepped out of his truck and looked around. His gaze moved from the repaired house to the new addition to the property stretching out behind it, and Clara watched his expression cycle through surprise, calculation, and something she had never seen on his face before: regret. It was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It was a small thing, a slight softening around the eyes, a loosening of the jaw that she recognized because she had spent a lifetime reading the faces of people who held power over her. Dale had never been cruel. He had been something worse. He had been indifferent. And indifference, when it came from someone who was supposed to love you, left a wound that was harder to heal than cruelty, because there was nothing to push back against. You could not fight someone who simply did not care enough to fight you. He did not apologize. Dale was not built for apology. But he stood in her yard with his hands in his pockets and told her the place looked good. He said the kids seemed happy. He said he should have come sooner. These were not the words she had once wanted to hear from him. She had once wanted him to say he was wrong, to admit that he had dismissed her, to acknowledge that his confidence had been built on her silence. But standing in the afternoon sun with the smell of dry grass and mineral earth in the air, she realized she no longer needed those words. She had outgrown the wound that had required them. She invited him in for coffee. They sat at the kitchen table, the same piece of furniture she had pressed her hands against in the duplex, now sitting in a different room in a different house on land that was worth more than Dale's entire life would ever generate. She did not mention the money. She did not mention the mineral rights or the lease or the trust or the attorney. She asked about his family. She asked about his work. She let him sit in her kitchen and drink her coffee and experience, perhaps for the first time, the quiet power of a woman who had nothing to prove, because she had already proven everything. When he left, he paused at the truck and looked back at her. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it and nodded instead. The nod carried more than any words he could have chosen. It was acknowledgment, reluctant but real, that the sister he had written off had built something he could not dismiss. Clara watched him drive away and felt nothing but peace. Dr. Petrovich continued her research on the site, publishing papers that brought academic attention to the property and established it as a significant geological discovery. The university entered into a long-term research agreement with Clara that allowed ongoing study while protecting the integrity of the land. Graduate students came each summer to map the mineral systems and study the aquifer. Clara welcomed them with coffee and directions to the alcove and the quiet satisfaction of someone who had opened a door that others were now walking through. The mining operation began 18 months after the lease was signed. It was smaller and more careful than Clara had imagined mining could be. The company used targeted extraction methods that minimized surface disruption, working from a single access point near the eastern edge of the property. Heavy equipment arrived on flatbed trucks that crawled up the dirt road in a slow procession that drew stares from every vehicle that passed on the highway. Clara watched from the porch as they set up, feeling the strange dissonance of industrial machinery arriving on land that had been silent for as long as anyone could remember. But the operation was disciplined. The extraction zone was contained. Buffer zones were established around the riverbed and the alcove, areas that Clara had declared permanently off-limits in the lease agreement. The spring would not be disturbed. The alcove would not be touched. Whatever was taken from beneath the ground would be taken carefully, and the land would be restored when the work was done. Clara visited the site regularly, walking the perimeter, asking questions, ensuring that the protections she had negotiated were being honored. She learned the names of the workers and the schedules of the shifts and the difference between the sounds the equipment made when it was operating correctly and when something needed attention. The foreman, a woman named Diane, who had been in mining for 20 years and who had a voice that carried across open ground like a bell, told Clara she was the most involved landowner she had ever worked with. Clara told her that involved was just another word for paying attention. Diane laughed and said she wished more landowners felt that way. The royalties began flowing within the first year of extraction. The numbers confirmed what the surveys had promised. The copper was high-grade and abundant. The silver and gold were consistent, and the rare earth elements, the cerium and neodymium that had made Marcus Chen set down his instruments and walk outside, were present in concentrations that placed the deposit among the most significant in the country. Clara used the money the way she used everything, carefully and with purpose. She funded the science program at the elementary school, equipping it with microscopes and rock kits, and a field trip to the State Geological Museum that made Marcus so excited he talked about it for 3 weeks. She established a scholarship at the county high school for students from low-income families who wanted to study science or engineering. She donated to the county library, not enough to rename it, but enough to expand the reference section and hire a part-time geologist who offered free consultations to anyone who walked in with a rock and a question. She also did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She created a fund in Edith Greer's name. The Edith Greer Land Preservation Trust was established to help small landowners in the region protect their properties from predatory acquisition. Clara had spent enough time in Janet Ruiz's office and enough hours reading the original survey documents to understand that her story was not unique. Across the West, people who owned land with hidden value were being approached by companies with teams of lawyers and geologists and the kind of patience that poor people could not afford to match. The offers came wrapped in friendliness. The pressure came later, dressed as concern. And the result, more often than not, it was that people who had held land for generations signed it away for pennies on the dollar because they did not know what they had or did not have the resources to find out. The trust provided legal assistance, geological assessments, and financial support to people who owned land that others wanted and who lacked the resources to defend it. Janet Ruiz agreed to sit on the board. Dr. Petrovich joined as a scientific advisor. Gerald Ashworth, the man who had knocked on her door with an envelope and a 40-year-old secret, contributed a significant sum and volunteered his time without being asked. He told Clara at the first board meeting that he had spent 40 years carrying the guilt of what the industry had done to people like Edith, and that this trust was the first thing he had encountered that felt like an adequate response. The trust's first case involved a widow 3 counties away whose property sat above a natural gas formation. Her name was Helen, and she was 72 years old and lived alone in a house her husband had built with his own hands before he died. A company had been pressuring her to sell for 18 months, using the same tactics that had been used against Edith decades earlier. They sent representatives to her door. They mailed her letters with numbers that seemed large, but were not. They had her property reassessed without her knowledge and sent her a tax bill that nearly doubled overnight, creating financial pressure designed to make the sale feel necessary. Helen had been close to signing when a neighbor told her about the Edith Greer Trust. The trust intervened, provided legal counsel, and funded an independent survey that confirmed the formation's worth. The property, which the company had offered Helen $400,000 for, contained natural gas reserves valued at over $60 million. Helen kept her land. She called Clara afterward, crying too hard to speak clearly, and Clara listened with the phone pressed to her ear and her eyes closed, remembering what it felt like to be the person on the other end of that call. The person who had nothing, the person everyone had counted out, the person who was still standing. When Helen finally caught her breath, she asked Clara why she had started the trust. Clara told her about Edith, about the stone, about the riverbed, about the 40 years of silence and the single name on a deed. She told Helen that the trust existed because the world was full of people who knew the price of everything and the value of nothing, and that someone had to stand on the other side of that equation. Helen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in a voice still thick with tears, that Edith would have been proud. Clara closed her eyes and pressed the phone tighter against her ear. "Yes," she said. "I think she would have been." On a quiet evening in late autumn, almost exactly 1 year after she had moved onto the property, Clara walked to the riverbed alone. The sun was low and golden, painting the land in the warm tones that made even the driest ground look rich. She descended into the bed and walked the familiar path, past the fork, through the narrow passage, around the curve to the alcove. The basin was there, unchanged. The water still rising, the colors still bright beneath the surface. She sat on the flat stone where she had sat the first time Dr. Petrovich visited and looked around the sheltered space. She thought about the woman she had been a year ago. The woman who cleaned motel rooms and packed warehouse boxes and fed her children rice and sat at a kitchen table in a leaning duplex, pressing her hands flat against the wood as if she could hold the world together by force of will alone. She thought about the laughter, the jokes about the Dust Bowl and the dry riverbed and the inheritance that was really a curse. She thought about Brenda's words. "That is not an inheritance. That is a guilt trip with a property line." She thought about Dale's words. "You do not know what you are doing." She thought about Steve and the supervisor and the woman at school pickup and every person who had looked at her and seen nothing worth noticing. And then she thought about Edith, about a woman who had stood in this same alcove 40 years earlier and decided that the land beneath her feet was worth more than comfort, more than money, more than the approval of people who could not see past the surface. A woman who had fought a corporation and won, and then spent the rest of her life in a house with a cracked window and a sagging porch. Not because she had to, but because the land needed a guardian, and she had chosen to be one. A woman who, in the end, had written a single name on a piece of paper and trusted the future to take care of itself. Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out the stone. Not one of the samples or the specimens or the carefully catalogued pieces that sat in Dr. Petrovich's lab. The original stone. The one Edith had pressed into her hand during that last visit. The one with the copper streak running through its center. She had found it in the junk drawer months ago and had carried it with her ever since. She held it now and turned it in her fingers, feeling its weight, its warmth from sitting close to her body all day. It came from the deep part, Edith had said. Clara closed her hand around the stone and held it against her chest. The water seeped. The colors shimmered. The ridges stood like shoulders on either side, sheltering the alcove from the wind and the noise and the careless gaze of a world that had never thought to look here. She sat in the quiet and let herself feel all of it. The struggle, the mockery. The doubt that had kept her awake at night, and the stubborn hope that had gotten her up each morning. The discovery, the fear, the overwhelming, terrifying, beautiful reality of a life that had changed, not because she was lucky, but because she had refused to stop looking when everyone else turned away. She had not inherited a dry riverbed. She had inherited a promise made by the earth itself over millions of years, carried upward through stone and water and time, and offered to anyone patient enough to follow it upstream. Edith had followed it. Clara had followed it. And now the promise was fulfilled, not in the minerals or the money or the reports with their staggering numbers, but in the simple fact that two women, separated by decades and connected by nothing more than trust and stubbornness, and had believed that what was hidden was worth finding. Clara stood and brushed the dust from her jeans. The sun was almost gone now, the sky deepening into purples and golds that made the land look like something from a painting. She walked back through the narrow passage, past the fork, up the bank, and across the open ground toward the house. The lights were on inside. She could see Marcus's silhouette in the window of the new addition, probably drawing at his desk. Lily's light was on too, and Clara could picture her reading, legs tucked beneath her, her face carrying the calm concentration of a girl who no longer watched her mother's expression for signs of disaster. The house was warm. Dinner was in the oven, something better than rice, something chosen because it tasted good rather than because it was cheap. The table was set for 3, and the chairs did not wobble, and the walls were thick enough that the only sound inside was the sound of her own family, living their lives in a place that belonged to them completely. Clara Maddox sat down at the table and placed the stone beside her plate. She looked at it for a moment, then looked at her children, then looked out the window at the land that stretched dark and quiet toward the ridges. She had followed the riverbed upstream. She had gone past the place where everyone else stopped, and she had found what was waiting there, not just copper and silver and gold and the rare elements that the modern world could not function without, but something rarer still. She had found proof that the things others throw away are sometimes the things worth keeping, and that the places others laugh about are sometimes the places that hold the most, and that the people others dismiss are sometimes the ones who see what no one else can. The riverbed was dry on the surface. It had always been dry on the surface, but underneath, where it mattered, it was alive, and so was she. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you will really enjoy them. And do not forget to subscribe if you have not already. See you in the next story.